There was a brooding and portentous silence. My head started to spin. Bertha gasped and covered her mouth in shock. I fixed my gaze on Ezekiel's face. The more I stared, the more I saw Amelia in him. Why had I not seen this before? I always felt an uncanny familiarity with this man. Why had I not sensed this? My lips quivered and I was unable to speak. Ezekiel's eyes had grown crimson, his pale face red with anger, yet he remained calm and silent. Oh, Eleanor, this man isn't fit to marry anybody. He ought to have remained in that asylum, but Amelia brought him back home out of the kindness of her heart. He has betrayed you, just as he betrayed his sister's trust, just as he betrayed Scarlett, though it is true she herself was a promiscuous rogue, exclaimed Pastor Franklin. I felt the earth shatter under my feet. The dizziness increased and my heart pounded. I turned to Pastor Franklin. Scarlett? Yes, Eleanor, Scarlett. Scarlett was that extortionist Hugo's niece. She worked as a parlour maid at Vernon Hall and... Before Pastor Franklin could complete his sentence, Ezekiel interjected. Pastor Franklin is right, Eleanor. I suppose the truth had to come out sooner or later. I am Christopher Vernon. I am Amelia's brother. And I have lied to you about many things, but I never lied about loving you. Though it is true that I initially pretended to love you. I wanted Vernon Hall back. That is why I tried to win your heart. But I genuinely fell in love with you, and that is God's truth. Bertha started sobbing. I kept staring at Ezekiel. He continued. I'm not a doctor, Eleanor. I only finished half of my studies in Vienna. Ever since I was a boy, I saw things, apparitions. I would hallucinate. My delusions grew stronger. I saw the ghost of Ezekiel Marlowe Lloyd. He commanded me to do horrid deeds. I almost strangled my own sister before I was stopped by Pastor Franklin. It is true my mother was delusional, but contrary to what I told you on the boat that night, Amelia wasn't mad. It was I who was in fact mad, and perhaps I still am. I was sent to an asylum. Whatever I narrated to you that night was true. I was the patient, and I lived through hell in that asylum. That is when Amelia brought me back home. The worst was yet to come. I won't lie to you. Distraught from the torture I'd endured in that asylum, and from all those cold and lonely nights, my life changed when I saw her. Scarlett, the new parlour maid at Vernon Hall. I immediately took a fancy to her. She was ravishing and seductive, not like any woman I had ever seen before. One night, as I sat in the secret garden, she came to me and seduced me. I surrendered to her that night under the ominous moon. I then met Scarlett very frequently in secret in the dungeon where you've kept my sister's body. We would meet after midnight when Amelia and the servants were asleep. We spent many hours there. He grew quiet for a moment, and there was an uncomfortable and embarrassing silence. The other men stood in silence, and Bertha looked as if she were about to faint. I took her out on the boat many nights. Scarlett was a maid, and she had little education. But she was sharp and intelligent. She liked poetry. That is why I wrote that poem for her, the one I recited to you on the boat. Despite requesting her not to divulge the details of our affair to anybody, Scarlett told her uncle Hugo. That dreadful man exploited my relationship with her, and in turn revealed our secret affair to Amelia. He then pressed Amelia for money. My sister believed such a scandal between her brother and a parlour maid would ruin the impeccable reputation of the Vernon family. I remember her warning distinctly. A scandal will ruin us, Christopher. Hugo is an extortionist. How do we know whether his niece is any different? She had a string of affairs with the male staff at Vernon Hall before your arrival. I should have ended her employment there and then, but I didn't out of charity. I'm warning you to end this affair before something disastrous occurs. In hindsight, I should have adhered to my sister's caveat, but I didn't. I was lost in the wantonness of my youth and Scarlett's ravishing beauty. We continued our clandestine affair. I even stole one of Amelia's precious pearl necklaces, the one with a black ribbon, and gifted it to her. Yes, Eleanor, when you told me you had seen the ghost of a parlour maid, I believed you. But I was afraid to tell you the truth. I was afraid of telling you that I had seen ghosts all my life. In any case, after a few months of a passionate affair with Scarlett, my attentions turned to another woman I had met during a ball. She was wealthy, and I deemed her to be a perfect match for myself, given her status. By that time, my health had improved. The delusions were gone, or so I thought. I decided to end my relationship with Scarlett. When Scarlett learned of this, she confronted me in the dungeon one winter's night. She carried a lantern in her hand that cast ghostly shadows on the wall, making that wretched serpent glow and look so very real. She threatened me, told me she would tell the entire town of our scandal. She pressed me for money. She screamed and hurled abuses at me. She slapped me and gradually became hysterical and violent. She ripped my shirt. I tried to calm her, but she wouldn't listen. She had infuriated me by then. You know, Eleanor, how easily I lose my temper. And then I saw him. I saw him again. Someone I hadn't seen in years. I saw the monstrous ghost of Ezekiel Marlowe Lloyd. I seized the lantern from Scarlett's hand and struck Lloyd's head fiercely and frantically with it. A few moments later, my delusions subsided, and when I next looked, I saw Scarlett lying lifeless on the ground, her face and the floor drenched in blood. I panicked and had no choice but to bring Amelia there. When Amelia came, she checked Scarlett's pulse and sobbed. No, what have you done? What will we do now? I calmed Amelia and reiterated that I hadn't killed Scarlett intentionally. It was an accident. Amelia was a kind woman. She empathized with me, as she knew I suffered from a malady. After all, I was her only brother. She knew if I stood trial, I would be hanged for a crime which I didn't intend to commit, or worse, I would be sent back to that dreadful asylum. I took Scarlett's body into the woodlands, and Amelia accompanied me. As I buried her body, Amelia wept beside the grave. She then asked me to leave England. If I had stayed, Hugo would have discovered the truth. Hugo was told his niece had eloped with somebody. He was a vile man, and he continued to press Amelia for money and threatened to expose my scandal if she didn't. A few weeks after my departure, Amelia told everybody I had died at sea. This is why, when Hugo saw me that night, he was horrified. He thought I was dead. Ezekiel ended his narrative abruptly, then wiped the perspiration from his forehead. All the while, everyone had stood very still and listened carefully to what he had to say. No words can describe the tumultuous emotions I experienced. The only thought that revolved in my mind was that everything beautiful was transient. This was the end of Ezekiel Lloyd, the man I had given my heart to, the man I was about to marry. Mr. Bartholomew cleared his throat and spoke. Christopher came to me a few months ago, Eleanor. I was shocked to see him alive. He didn't know Amelia had taken you as her ward, and that she had left everything to you in her will. He was furious and cursed me for persuading Amelia to do so. The truth is, I didn't persuade Amelia. Knowing Christopher had acted recklessly in the past and knowing of his psychological state, Amelia changed the will of her own volition. I won't be surprised if he was marrying you for the property. Perhaps he would have pressed you to pass on the title to him in due course. I really don't know. Ezekiel scoffed and shook his head. Perhaps. Perhaps that is how it started. But that isn't why I decided to marry her. I love her, and for once in my life, I was trying to do what was right. Pastor Franklin then interrupted. Eleanor, Amelia never kept any secrets from me. She trusted me. She told me everything. I knew what Christopher had done. I knew Scarlett's body was buried in the woodlands, though I would never have told anyone about it, including my wife and son. I knew Christopher was not dead, just in exile. Eleanor, Amelia loved you more than anything in this world. She was racked with guilt after Scarlett's death. She never liked that woman, but she never wanted her murdered. That is why she decided to take you in, to give you a lavish life, to leave everything to you. It was atonement for her. She could see you had a pure soul. Christopher may have been her brother by blood, and you may have not been her daughter by blood, but she adored you, Eleanor. When the pastor finished speaking, I broke down in tears. Ezekiel stood still and made no attempt to comfort me. It was Bertha who came to my rescue and embraced me, kissing my forehead and uttering words of consolation. Pastor Franklin spoke again. Chief Inspector, if you please. The man wearing the long grey coat and hat approached Ezekiel and spoke in a polite yet stern manner. Mr. Lloyd, you are being arrested for murder. Please walk with me and don't make things difficult for yourself. The chief inspector gently grasped Ezekiel's arm and led him out. The rest of us followed. A police carriage awaited with 2 constables standing beside the carriage like soldiers. I didn't quite know whether to hate Ezekiel or to love him. It had become apparent that Ezekiel only wanted to marry me to retrieve what he had lost. As for his passionate kisses, which meant the world to me, they clearly never meant anything to him. I was just a pawn in the game. I was coming to terms with this harsh, heartbreaking reality. As the constable opened the carriage door and the chief inspector directed Ezekiel to sit inside, Ezekiel suddenly shoved him and struck the constable's face ferociously, breaking his nose and drenching his face in blood. The scene turned to panic. The other constable blew his whistle frantically as Ezekiel dashed. Pastor Franklin Gareth and the other constable chased him. Mr. Bartholomew assisted the chief inspector. Bertha and I ran after Pastor Franklin. I wept whilst running. Whilst part of me hated Ezekiel, part of me still loved him. Ezekiel, please stop. For my sake, Ezekiel, I cried. Ezekiel darted to the verge of the cliffs with his long strides, then glanced at me one last time, sorrowfully, before flinging himself into the abyss of the sea. Pastor Franklin and Garrett shouted in shock. The constable continued to blow his whistle, panic-stricken. Bertha gasped and screamed. I was vertiginous. The skies, the edge of the cliff, the sea, everything spun wildly before my eyes. I collapsed, my mind sank into a deadly darkness, and the last thing I remember was Garrett shouting to me, Eleanor! Eleanor!